The town of Middleton wasn't remarkable on the surface. It was a quiet, picturesque place with neatly lined streets, a single coffee shop, and a park where time seemed to slow down. The kind of place where everyone knew each other's names and nodded politely while passing on the street. But beneath this charming veneer was a current of unease, a divide that everyone felt but few dared to name. For years, Officer Daniel Grayson had patrolled the town with a badge that might as well have been a crown. Tall, broad-shouldered, and always wearing aviator sunglasses, he radiated authority, often in ways that made people feel more fearful than safe. Grayson was the kind of cop who believed in order above all else, even if it meant bending or outright breaking the rules to impose it. And his idea of order often came at the expense of the most vulnerable members of the community. One of those members was Edith Harrison. Everyone called her Miss Edie. At 78 years old, she was a fixture in Middleton. She had lived in the same small bungalow for nearly half a century, surviving on a modest pension, and the goodwill of neighbors who loved her baked goods and warm demeanor. She had raised 3 children on her own after her husband passed away in the 70s, and though they had long since moved to distant cities, she remained the heart of the community. Miss Edie spent her days tending to her vibrant garden, walking her little dachshund, Benny, and volunteering at the church food pantry. She had a way of making everyone feel at ease, her laugh a gentle melody that drifted through the air like a summer breeze. But her kindness didn't shield her from prejudice. Grayson had always viewed Miss Edie with a quiet contempt he tried to mask as professionalism. She was a black woman who didn't fit his narrow, outdated views of who belonged in Middleton. Though he had no legitimate reason to harass her, he found small excuses: a poorly parked car, a cracked fence post encroaching on a neighbor's property line, or Benny's barking disturbing the peace. For Miss Edie, these interactions were exhausting, but familiar. She had seen men like Grayson before, and she knew better than to antagonize him. Just let him talk himself out, she often thought. But Grayson never quite talked himself out. He only grew bolder. The last straw came on a humid August afternoon. Miss Edie had just finished her weekly walk with Benny, the two of them ambling down the shaded streets of Middleton. Her floral sundress clung to her frame, and her wide-brimmed hat drooped from the heat. She stopped by the local farmer's market to pick up some tomatoes and fresh basil, smiling as she chatted with the vendors. "Miss Edie, how's that garden of yours?" asked Peter, the teenage boy who sold her vegetables every week. "Oh, it's thriving, Peter. I'll be bringing you some of my squash soon. Too much for me to eat on my own," she replied with a wink. Peter grinned. "I'll hold you to that." As she started her slow walk back home, she noticed a familiar police cruiser parked at the corner of her street. Officer Grayson was leaning against the door, arms crossed, his mirrored sunglasses reflecting the sunlight. A sinking feeling settled in her chest. She kept walking, hoping he wouldn't notice her, but Benny's excited bark gave her away. "Miss Harrison!" Grayson called out, his voice sharp. "Got a minute?" She stopped, tightening her grip on Benny's leash. "Good afternoon, Officer Grayson," she replied, her voice steady but cautious. "What can I do for you?" Grayson pushed himself off the car and sauntered over, his boots crunching against the gravel. "There have been complaints about Benny barking again," he said, gesturing toward the dachshund, who wagged his tail innocently. "Disturbing the peace." Miss Edie frowned. "Benny? He's hardly loud enough to disturb anyone, officer. He only barks when he's excited." Grayson shrugged, leaning closer. "Rules are rules, ma'am. I'm just here to enforce them." Her jaw tightened. She knew this wasn't about Benny. This was about control. Still, she chose her words carefully. "I understand, officer. I'll do my best to keep him quiet." Grayson smirked, the corner of his mouth twitching in a way that made her stomach churn. "See that you do. Next time, I might have to issue a citation." With that, he tipped his hat and walked back to his cruiser, leaving Miss Edie standing in the sweltering heat. She exhaled deeply, the tension slowly draining from her body. But something told her this wasn't the end of it. It happened 3 days later. Miss Edie was in her garden, trimming the sunflowers that had grown taller than she was. Benny was lying at her feet, lazily chewing on a stick. The sun was high in the sky, and the air was thick with the scent of blooming flowers. It should have been a peaceful afternoon, but the sound of tires crunching on her gravel driveway shattered the calm. She turned to see Grayson's cruiser pulling up. He stepped out, his hand resting on the baton at his hip. "Miss Harrison," he called out, striding toward her. "We've got a problem." Miss Edie straightened, wiping her hands on her apron. "What's the matter, officer?" "Got another complaint about Benny," he said, nodding toward the dog. "Said he was barking at the neighbor kids." Miss Edie's brow furrowed. "That can't be right. Benny's been here with me all afternoon." Grayson's expression hardened. "You calling me a liar, ma'am?" Her breath caught in her throat. "No, officer. I'm just saying it must be a mistake." Grayson stepped closer, towering over her. "Mistake or not, I need to take a look around, make sure everything's in order." Miss Edie hesitated. She knew her rights, but she also knew challenging him would only escalate the situation. "You're welcome to look, officer, but I assure you there's nothing wrong." He didn't wait for her permission, walking past her and into the yard. Benny stood up, barking nervously. Grayson turned back, glaring at the dog. "Shut that mutt up," he snapped. Miss Edie's hands trembled as she reached down to pick Benny up. "It's okay, Benny," she whispered, but Benny, sensing her fear, barked louder. "That's it!" Grayson growled. He grabbed his baton, brandishing it as he stepped toward the dog. "No!" Miss Edie cried, stepping between them. "You can't! He's just a dog!" Grayson's eyes narrowed. "Step aside, ma'am." When she didn't move, he shoved her back, hard. She stumbled, falling to the ground with a cry of pain. Benny barked furiously, his tiny body vibrating with rage. "You think you can defy me?" Grayson sneered, standing over her. "You people never learn, do you?" Tears stung Miss Edie's eyes as she struggled to sit up. "Please, officer, just leave us alone." But he didn't leave. He raised his baton as if to strike, when a voice rang out. "Hey, what the hell do you think you're doing?" Both Grayson and Miss Edie turned toward the voice. Standing at the edge of the driveway was a figure neither of them expected. Jake Paul. Jake Paul stood at the edge of the driveway, his hands clenched into fists, and his face set in a grim expression. He was dressed casually in athletic shorts and a loose hoodie, the kind of outfit that made it easy to mistake him for just another passerby. But Jake was anything but ordinary. His fame preceded him, even in the quiet town of Middleton. He'd been in town for a few days shooting content for his channel, some sort of rural survival challenge, the kind of stunt that thrilled his fans and kept his name buzzing online. He hadn't expected to get involved in something like this, but as he jogged past Miss Edie's house and saw what was happening, his instincts kicked in. "I said, what the hell do you think you're doing?" Jake repeated, stepping closer. Grayson turned, his lips curling into a sneer as he assessed the newcomer. "This isn't your business, pal. Move along." Jake didn't budge. His eyes flicked to Miss Edie, who was still on the ground, cradling Benny in her arms. Her face was pale, her hands shaking. The sight sent a jolt of anger through him. "Looks like you're harassing an elderly woman," Jake said, his voice low and steady. "That's everyone's business." Grayson bristled, puffing out his chest. "You don't know what's going on here, so I suggest you keep walking before you get yourself into trouble." Jake raised an eyebrow. "Trouble? The only trouble I see is you. Now, why don't you put down that baton, apologize to this lady, and get back in your car?" Grayson took a step forward, towering over Jake. "I don't take orders from wannabe celebrities," he spat, "and I don't owe anyone an apology." Jake smirked, the kind of cocky, fearless grin that had become his trademark. Big talk for a guy who's about to go viral for all the wrong reasons. He pulled out his phone and started recording, angling it to capture Grayson's face and the scene behind him. "Say cheese, officer. I'm sure my 20 million followers would love to see how Middleton's finest treat their citizens. Grayson's face darkened, his hand tightening around the baton. Turn that off, he snarled. Not a chance, Jake shot back. Now, are you going to back off, or do we have to take this further? For a moment, time seemed to stand still. Grayson's grip on the baton tightened, and for a brief, terrifying second, it looked like he might strike Jake. But Jake didn't flinch. He stood his ground, his phone still recording, his gaze locked on the officer. You think you can intimidate me? Grayson said, his voice low and dangerous. You don't know who you're messing with? Jake tilted his head, feigning curiosity. Oh, I know exactly who I'm messing with. A bully with a badge. The question is, do you know who you're messing with? Grayson hesitated, clearly debating whether to escalate the situation. The tension was palpable, crackling in the humid air like an impending storm. Miss Edie watched from the ground, her heart pounding as she clutched Benny close. She wanted to intervene, to say something, but the fear rooting her to the spot was too strong. Finally, Grayson lowered the baton, though his glare didn't soften. You've made your point, he said through gritted teeth, but don't think this is over. Jake took a step forward, his expression hardening. Oh, it's over. You're done here. Get in your car and leave. For a moment, Grayson didn't move. Then, slowly, he turned and walked back to his cruiser. The tension didn't lift until the sound of his engine faded into the distance. Jake turned to Miss Edie, rushing to her side. Are you okay, ma'am? He asked, crouching down to help her up. Miss Edie nodded, though her hands were still trembling. I think so. Thank you. I don't know what would have happened if you hadn't shown up. Jake offered her a reassuring smile. You don't have to thank me. Nobody deserves to be treated like that. He glanced at Benny, who was licking Miss Edie's hand, his little body trembling with nerves. Looks like your pup's a fighter, too, Jake said, scratching Benny behind the ears. Miss Edie managed a small smile. He's braver than I am. Jake shook his head. You're plenty brave. Standing up to a guy like that takes guts. He helped her to her feet and guided her to a nearby bench. Let's get you inside, he said. You should rest. Jake stayed with Miss Edie for the rest of the afternoon, making sure she was okay and helping her clean up the scratches on her arms from the fall. He also made some calls to the local news station, to his own PR team, and to a lawyer friend he trusted. He wasn't going to let Grayson get away with what he'd done. The video Jake had recorded went viral within hours. By the next morning, sure justice for Miss Edie was trending across social media. People from all over the world were outraged, flooding Middleton's police department with calls and emails demanding accountability. The pressure worked. Within days, Grayson was placed on administrative leave pending an investigation. The town's mayor held a press conference, promising reforms and assuring the public that such behavior would not be tolerated. As for Jake, he stayed in Middleton long enough to make sure Miss Edie was safe and supported. He even organized a fundraiser for her, raising enough money to fix up her house and cover any legal fees she might need. But more than that, he made sure her story was heard. You don't have to be famous to make a difference, Jake said in a follow-up video to his fans. You just have to care. Grayson drove away, but the tension lingered in the air long after the sound of his engine faded. Miss Edie sat on her porch swing, cradling Benny in her lap, as Jake stood nearby, scanning the street as if expecting the officer to return. The adrenaline was still coursing through him, his hands slightly trembling as he checked his phone to confirm the recording had saved. That guy's a piece of work, Jake muttered, shaking his head. You've had to deal with him before, haven't you? Miss Edie sighed, her voice shaky but composed. Too many times. He's always finding excuses to come by, always looking for something to hold over me. But today, she trailed off, her eyes welling with tears. Today was different. He was angrier. I thought he was really going to hurt me. Jake knelt beside her, his expression softening. Hey, you don't have to worry about him anymore. That video's gonna make sure of it. Miss Edie placed a trembling hand on his shoulder. "Thank you. You didn't have to step in, but you did. That means the world to me." Jake grinned, trying to lighten the mood. "What kind of guy would I be if I just walked by? Besides," he added with a wink, "my fans would roast me alive if they found out I ignored a situation like this." Miss Edie chuckled despite herself, shaking her head. "I don't know much about all that internet stuff, but I know a good man when I see one. You did right by me today." The following days were a whirlwind. Jake uploaded the video that evening, framing it with a heartfelt monologue about the importance of standing up against abuse of power. The clip of Grayson shoving Miss Edie and threatening her with his baton quickly gained traction, shared across platforms by influencers, activists, and everyday citizens. Within 24 hours, news outlets picked up the story. Headlines like "Racist Cop Exposed by YouTuber Jake Paul" and "Elderly Woman's Harassment Sparks Outrage" flooded social media. Jake's followers rallied behind Miss Edie, flooding her with messages of support and offers to help. Grayson, on the other hand, faced the full brunt of public outrage. The Middleton Police Department issued a statement claiming they would investigate the incident, but it wasn't enough to stem the backlash. Protesters gathered outside the station, holding signs that read, "Justice for Miss Edie" and "End Police Brutality." In Middleton, the video ignited a firestorm. For years, many residents had tolerated Grayson's behavior, unwilling or unable to challenge him. But Jake's video forced them to confront the ugly truth. The local church held a town meeting, inviting citizens to share their stories. Person after person came forward, describing instances of intimidation, harassment, and abuse by Grayson. Some were too afraid to speak, but the growing support emboldened others to step forward. Miss Edie attended the meeting, her frail frame seeming smaller than ever as she stood at the front of the room. Jake stood beside her, offering silent support. When she spoke, her voice was clear and unwavering. "I've lived in Middleton for over 50 years, she began. "This is my home, and I've loved this town, even when it hasn't always loved me back. But no one, no matter who they are, deserves to be treated the way I was treated. It's time we stand up and say, enough is enough." The room erupted in applause, and for the first time in days, Miss Edie felt a glimmer of hope. As the situation escalated, Jake found himself thrust into a role he hadn't anticipated: activist. Though his content usually focused on entertainment and high-energy stunts, he realized the platform he had built could be used for something bigger. He started a campaign to raise funds for Miss Edie, ensuring she had the resources to repair her home and secure legal representation if needed. Within days, the campaign exceeded its goal, with donations pouring in from around the world. Jake also reached out to civil rights organizations, connecting Miss Edie with experienced advocates who could help her navigate the legal system. He even offered to cover the costs of a security system for her house, knowing she might not feel safe in her own home until real change occurred. Under immense public pressure, the police department moved quickly to address the situation. Grayson was suspended without pay while an external investigation began. It wasn't long before more complaints against him surfaced, painting a damning picture of his career. Miss Edie's lawyer, a sharp and determined woman named Angela Ruiz, filed a formal lawsuit against Grayson and the Middleton Police Department, citing years of harassment and emotional distress. Jake continued to amplify her story, using his platform to keep the spotlight on Middleton and ensure the case wasn't swept under the rug. Months later, the case went to trial. The courtroom was packed with reporters, activists, and supporters of Miss Edie, all eager to see justice served. Jake sat in the front row, his presence a constant reminder of the public's interest in the case. The trial was intense, with Angela Ruiz presenting a mountain of evidence against Grayson. Video footage, eyewitness testimonies, and records of prior complaints painted a clear picture of his abuse of power. Grayson's defense team tried to discredit Miss Edie, claiming her allegations were exaggerated, But Miss Edie's quiet dignity and unwavering testimony won over the jury. In the end, the verdict was unanimous. Grayson was found guilty of multiple counts of misconduct and excessive use of force. He was stripped of his badge and sentenced to community service, probation, and mandatory sensitivity training. For Miss Edie, it wasn't just about punishment. It was about accountability. She hoped the outcome would serve as a warning to others who thought they could abuse their authority without consequences. With the trial behind her, Miss Edie finally felt a sense of peace. Her home was repaired, her garden blooming brighter than ever. Benny, now something of a local celebrity, basked in the attention of neighbors who stopped by with treats and pats. Jake visited her one last time before leaving Middleton, sitting with her on the porch as the sun dipped below the horizon. "You've got a lot of fans out there, Miss Edie," he said with a grin. "They're calling you a hero." Miss Edie chuckled, shaking her head. "I'm no hero, Jake. I'm just a stubborn old woman who had enough." Jake smiled, his gaze thoughtful. "Well, sometimes that's exactly what the world needs." As he stood to leave, Miss Edie reached out and took his hand. "Thank you, Jake, for everything. You're a good man." Jake gave her hand a gentle squeeze. "Take care of yourself, Miss Edie, and if you ever need me, you know where to find me." With that, he walked down the driveway and into the night, leaving behind a town forever changed and a legacy of courage that would inspire others for years to come.